All right, welcome to today's episode of the Australian Lawn and Garden Podcast. This episode, Craig, I was telling you just before, this is just for me, really. This is a selfish episode because I wanted to learn from somebody who has your type of experience and knowledge. And so I invited you to come on, but we're going to have a conversation between the two of us, and maybe a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand people might listen. You are an expert in what you call edible gardens. I am a gardener. I know nothing about edible gardens, and I have just spent my whole career making things look pretty. And I'm getting a bit older, and I'm feeling like I want to start growing some things at home. And yeah, I could probably do a half decent job just by the fact that I've been growing things as a paid profession my whole life. But you start going down this rabbit hole of food and how to get it right, and nutrition and bugs, and I'm clueless. And so I wanted to have you on. I think from what I've heard, this could be about a 17-hour podcast because I've watched a couple of videos of yours, and it's like once you get started, it's like a freight train. We're going to need a lot.
Yeah.
So, but I love that. And that's why I wanted you on, because I think you've got, how many years you say? 40 years experience?
Yeah,
Something like
more
that?
years than I can care to count, to be honest. Over 45 years.
You've written 5 books, right?
Yeah, 5 books. Number 6 is on the way.
And you're all about this one sort of, well, not just one subject, but you're really focusing on helping people learn how to grow food. So I think there's a whole bunch of people who have just clicked on this podcast and gone, this is exactly the thing I've been looking for. And look, we're going to have some fun. So welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, look, I started out, left school pretty early and got an apprenticeship as an apprentice nurseryman. Started working in wholesale and retail nurseries, worked in some orchards and so forth. Did a bit of a stint with landscape gardening, and I've sort of been in gardening all my life. No matter where I've lived, though, I've sort of always tried to grow my own food. And when I left home, got married and built a house, when I started to hit the garden, my wife said, I don't want a vegetable garden. I said, are you serious? This is the whole reason this is why I exist. That was a bit of a down. I'm thinking, how the hell am I going to get around this? So, and it was a very awkward block. It was a 5-sided block. We had, big cutaways. So we had an embankment that I had to hold back with slippery retaining walls. And we backed onto a creek, which was the longest side of the property. It was quite narrow. It was pretty hard sort of a place to work at. And so I kick-started it and I started planting out. And I put a couple of fruit trees here and there. And I started to put in, miniature roses and some standard miniatures. And I put in a bluestone border edge. And then I started, I'm going to sneak a lettuce in here. So I put a red lettuce, and then I put a green lettuce, and then I put a blue flowering lobelia. And then
with your roses?
Yeah, in amongst, yeah. And then I started, I thought, you know what? I'm going to put because my ex-wife now, then wife, did not want to know about vegetable gardens. And she sort of did me a favour because I tried to find innovative ways of being able to sneak these little edibles in. And what I was realising was these weren't getting hit by pests. I'm thinking, because normally if I had put that in a vegetable patch, I would have been eaten out of house and home, and I wasn't having to worry about snail baits or, all sorts of, anyway, look, cut a long story short, now knowing what I know, I realised that this is how things grow in nature. That nothing grows in a monocultured crop, nothing grows in rows, and ultimately this is how these plants survive. I mean, they're dispersed so that they land in the right sort of spot within the forest, and they're surrounded often by companion plants that actually either deter predatory insects or attract in pollinators, or whatever the case. So that sort of kick-started me off down that journey. Plus, my father, who was he was one of those persistent fellas. If he wanted to make his point with you, he would tell you the same thing 1,000 times until you gave in. And we had this place down the beach it was a caravan and annex on site. And I would go down there on the weekend, and he'd say, "Son, you've got to come up and see this place called Heronswood. It's a Diggers Seed Club garden, and it's a heritage listed place." And I said, "Dad, I don't want to be rude, mate, but I work in gardens every day of the week. The last thing I want to do is come home and have a look at another garden." So anyway, 1,000 times later, I gave up. And as we walked out of the car park toward this garden that he wanted to show me, from a distance, I couldn't believe what I was looking at. It was just the most unique, uniform parterre garden that I'd seen. It was so colourful. And the closer I got to it, the more I realised that every plant in that garden was edible. They had landscaped with this, and that just blew me away. I mean, there was red and green cabbages side by side one another, and there was a row of leeks behind, and in the back of that there was rainbow chard of every different colour you could think of. They had some sunflowers right over in the background, and they had some corn in front of it, and like I just couldn't believe what I was looking at. So that sort of kick-started me down the path of edible gardening, and look, many years on now, I've realised that sort of unknowingly kick-started me into this journey of where I'm at now.
So this is what I like, for whatever reason, because I'm just like you, right? And I have been for a long time, where you work in lawns and gardens every single day, and you just go, the last thing I want to do when I get home is to work in my own lawn and garden. What I started doing, though, a few years ago was I used to be, maybe 5-6 years ago, I used to be the sort of guy who, like this old story about the mechanic's car. They service everyone else's car. Their car is, well overdue. My garden was a little bit like that. It never got out of control, but it was like, it didn't look pristine. And then I started wanting to experiment and grow, my knowledge, and understand things. And it started becoming fun to experiment and try things out. And then my lawn and garden became very, very beautiful. And I'm starting to feel that with the veggie side of it, or growing edible food. And what I liked about what I've seen a little bit of your garden through the videos you've done with Vasily, a couple of videos you've done on YouTube. By the way, people, Craig has his own YouTube channel, so you've got a bunch of videos on there from some of them 10 years old or something like that, right? But I love that you'll have like lavender, right, and a nice big lavender in flower, and you'll have some lettuce next to it, or you'll have some broad beans next to it. And I've never thought about that. I always thought that you needed and it doesn't make any, it just, you don't need to do it this way, but everybody has their raised garden bed, which is probably corrugated iron, and I'm like, I don't really have space for that. But here's the thing that you were saying on one of your videos, you were like, you're pulling out these weeds. Right, if you're going to pull out weeds, you may as well replace it with a veggie. I put in annuals all the time. I put in petunias and lobelias and marigolds and snapdragons, and to fill in spaces around my roses. But you're right that like a red cabbage, or like a colorful type of lettuce or something like that could bring that color I'm looking for, and I'm still got something I can eat. And why couldn't I plant it next to my rose?
No, well, that's true. Look, I think one of the things is that, and it's ingrained in us, and it's what we were brought up with. I know my grandparents, when I went to their place, they had a vegetable patch, and everything was in neat, nice rows. And that's ingrained in us. I mean, if you go to a market garden, they're in rows, and they're a monoculture crop, and they're in nice straight rows. And I've got to tell you that at the outset, and I guess this is what drives me, is that if you start growing like the farmers, you've got to start and spray like the farmers, and you've got to fertilise like the farmers, and you've got to water like they have. And that's where we get ourselves into trouble. None of us have that time or expertise. Okay, and we have to do that because if you don't spray like they do, you put a row of cabbage out in a vegetable patch, in no time flat you're going to be inundated with cabbage white butterfly, and it won't be long before you've been eaten out of house and home. Now, that's your fault because you've had the neon signs out for the cabbage moth to come along.
I see what you're saying.
All right. So the idea behind edible gardening is a very different place to a vegetable garden. And vegetable gardens get most of us into trouble. We have to worry about crop rotation because we're cropping. You know, in an edible garden, there is no cropping. So you don't have to worry about crop rotation because there is no cropping, you see. So ultimately is, for me, and this is where I try and get people started, is if you're pulling out weeds out of your garden, you've got a spot to be growing either a companion plant or an edible of some sort. Now, wide leaf plants, funnily enough, are shade tolerant plants. That's why they've got wide leaves. They have wide leaves to filter the sunlight through the treetops. Contrary to what often the labels will say. You know, they'll say full sun, but that's unfortunate because the labelling here is not terribly good. And I apologise to Norwood Press because they're generally the ones that do this. They're using books and information from where these plants are native to. And our climates are very different to the places that these plants are from. And you put them out in the full sun, and I guarantee you, if you're not watering them often like the farmers have to, you know, they're going to sit there and wilt, and they're going to be, you know, second-rate plants for sure. So the idea is to pull out a weed and replace the weed with something edible or something that will companion plant what you've planted. And I suggest to people to do that on a daily basis. Take up the Edible Garden Challenge. Pull out a weed and replace it with an edible. And you'll be gobsmacked. If you take that on board for 6 weeks, you will be gobsmacked at how less weeds you've got and how many more plants and edibles that you'll be starting to pick and put on the table. You know, a full garden grows no weeds. You think about that. You know, wherever your garden is really, really full, there are no weeds grow there. You outcompete them. So why wouldn't you do that with something you can put on your plate? And you get the opportunity to use the shape and the colour of the edibles that are available, to say nothing of the fact that you rightly point out, lobelias and marigolds and calendulas and all sorts, salvias, and you can have those in the background as well that are going to help attract in pollinating insects. You know, for instance, we're heading into the tomato season, so something mauve or blue flowering will attract in the blue-banded bee, which happens to love tomatoes. And they're a buzz pollinator, whereas the European honeybee doesn't go near tomatoes and doesn't like them. So if you want a really good bumper crop, then that's what you would plant with tomatoes. What goes well on the plate together goes well in the ground together. So, for instance, you know, when I ever plant tomatoes, I never ever plant tomatoes together. I've always grown them with what goes well on that plate together. So if it was, and back in March, April, when I plant garlic, which is one of the trio, basil, garlic and tomato on the plate, it's a marriage made in heaven. So I start thinking about where in my garden am I likely to plant a tomato? And by the way, tomatoes are vines. They grow through trees on the outskirts of a forest. They do not like full sun. So if you've got them out in the full sun, you really want to rein that in and keep them out of the sun by, you know, from about 1 o'clock onwards. They tend to do far better. And so I start thinking about, you know, okay, so I'm going to plant tomato here. I'll put a ring of garlic of maybe a metre in diameter, and X will mark the spot for one tomato around about October, November, when we're getting reasonably warm soil temperatures, and that's when I'll plant them. Then I'll put 2 or 3 different types of basil, maybe a Thai basil, a lettuce leaf basil, and maybe a Greek basil. And then we'll in between the garlic or in between the other plants there, I'll put a few different varieties of lettuce, maybe a red, a green, and maybe a cos, maybe some rocket. Think about what you would put on in a salad bowl, some spring onion. And by the time you're starting to move away from the central part of this group, being the tomato, you know, you're on the outskirts, maybe some cucumber, maybe some small growers. Do you see where I'm headed? I mean, it's and this group happens to look after itself. You know, you generally, and I always, by the way, whenever I put a tomato in the ground, I always make sure that I put a marigold in there, because the aromatic foliage of the marigold tends to repel a lot of the sap-sucking insects, things like thrips, whitefly, aphids, and the roots of the marigolds keep the nematodes away from the roots in the tomatoes, which they're quite often susceptible to. And as luck would have it, the petals from the flower are edible. They look fantastic chucked in a salad. So it's very simple, you know. And if you're looking for holes in your garden, and you've got an area where you could put a group like that, you know, that's simple stuff.
Do you know, when I first started my business, all I really did was mowing lawns. Like, I think a lot of people are just like that. Mowing lawns, basic mulching stuff, things like that. That gets tiring pretty quickly. At least that was what my experience was. And the reality is that when I changed my model from being something that just did lawn mowing to just did basic gardening services to somebody who could identify and solve issues and do product applications, two things happened. One, I made a lot more money per hour. Clients are much more willing to pay higher money for weed control, fungicide applications, fertilization, all that sort of stuff. They see it as a more technical, rightly so, more technical and thus more valuable service. So way higher hourly rates when doing those services. The second thing that happened is it gave and it reinvigorated my passion for the industry, because I went from somebody who was just doing lowly mowing jobs seen as a low life in society by some, others not. But yeah, you know what it's like if you're in business, to somebody who could solve people's problems, to somebody who could actually help them get a beautiful place to live. And I went back to really, really enjoying my job again. What's really cool is that we have a sponsor that literally sells every single product that I have used and use right now in my lawn care packages for my clients. And I'm honored to have them as a sponsor because the Lawn Shed, which is the sponsor, they're backed by and a partner business to the Living Turf, which is Australia's largest lawn product supplier. The thing about this, though, is that the Lawn Shed has a trade login and they have literally designed their website and their service around small businesses. I don't know of any other business that is literally dedicated solely to small businesses. And the thing that is really great is some of you might be listening to this going, I don't know how to do product applications. That's way too technical. They've got expert advice, people who are actually willing to answer your questions. And what you will find is you're going to learn very quickly going and buying a couple of bags of fertilizers, asking for some advice, applying it on your own lawn, testing it out on some friends, seeing the results, getting the confidence from that. Same with all the other products that they could sell. That's exactly what I did, honestly. Tried it on family, tried it on my own lawn, got experience with it, asked people to use it before, went out and used it, got those amazing results. And that was the start of me turning my business from something that was, making money, but not, I didn't really love it, to something that was making great money. And I really did enjoy it. If you go on the Lawn Shed, and this sounds like something that's going to help your business, sign up to their trade account, because there's some products that you won't see on the normal account. They only provide it to small businesses. Through the trade account, they will prioritize you as a small business compared to other people or other businesses out there. And if you go and sign up, say that you heard us from the Australian Lawn and Garden podcast, and that will support us as a podcast. I genuinely am glad to have that as a partner, because the reality is that it's a true story, close to my heart, and it is genuinely something I believe in, not just a cash grab like some other sponsorships might have been. So jump on them, the Lawn Shed, the trade section, jump there. Let's get back into the podcast. I feel like what you've just done there is given us the overview of your philosophy of edible gardening, which is not this monocrop style, copy what the farmer does, but look at what you've got and use your own garden and what you already have to make something. You talk about a tomato growing up a tree. It's like, yeah, that's a no-brainer. And we spend all this time staking, right? And you got to spend money and time staking. I've got some olive trees out the back. Would it make sense for me to just plant a tomato underneath the olive tree, put some wire around the trunk or something like that, or some string or something for it to climb on, and just let it climb up that?
Yeah, you can do that easy. I mean, all you really need to do is depending upon, I mean, there are two types of tomatoes. Obviously, there's indeterminate and determinate. So the indeterminate ones are the taller growing ones, and they tend to fruit over time. And what I would do, and they're the taller growers, so I would tie something around the main trunk of the olive tree and tie that back to the base of the tomato, and just simply wind the tomato around the. You don't even need anything more than that. We had a Roma tomato out in the front yard, and my front garden would only be 3 meters wide from the footpath to where the start of the garden is, and we had a Roma tomato there, which I didn't stake, I didn't water, I don't feed plants, so and it just went to its own devices. And if we didn't pick nearly 300 tomatoes off that, I'd go there. You know, and it was all over the ground. You know, so people, we muck around with plants so much. Seriously, you know
I was going to say, I've got a funny story about tomatoes too. Sorry, I cut you off, but I used to have some cherry tomatoes. So I have grown things over the years, but I've never been able to go for a long time. But it was a season where I was having a lot of salads and I was eating a lot of cherry tomatoes and a lot of spinach. So I tried growing those two. Spinach didn't do so well. Cherry tomatoes went off the charts. And then one day, my dog discovered that she liked eating my cherry tomatoes, right? And so there goes that, right? Because she's a Kelpie, so she can jump whatever barrow you put in place. Anyways, next year, there's cherry tomatoes growing everywhere throughout the entire property because she's just been like crapping out the seeds everywhere. And we had this pond that was this is at the previous house we're at. It was a pond that was in a terribly designed area, and so we never went out there. And my dog had this fantastic habit that I promise I only picked up in 5 or 6 years, 6 or 7, maybe less than 10 times did I ever pick up after my dog, because she had this habit of just pooing in one spot, and we never went out there. So we're like, well, whatever, you know. And so, anyways, there was a pond that had been sort of covered over, so the water would sort of retain the moisture there. And one of these tomatoes that had just sort of sprouted in that wetter area, that almost made it through the entire summer without any irrigation. And it was just, but she kept eating it. We didn't eat anything off it. She kept eating all the tomatoes off it, right? Like as soon as they started going yellow, they were gone. But it's like, man, it's interesting that you put so much effort into growing something, you know, and it doesn't succeed. And the dog just craps something out the back corner and it works out pretty well.
That's it. Yeah. Look, I was explaining before we started recording how I sort of a couple of years ago went down the rabbit hole of soil, and I've been studying soil microbiology for the last couple of years. And I sort of said just before that, I don't feed plants, and that's something that we've had wrong, which I had no idea about when I left horticultural college. You know, it was all about feeding plants. You know, we were using slow release fertilizers in the top of pots. We were even using them when we landscape gardens. You know, it was slow release fertilizer, whether it was a 3 to 4 month or an 8 to 9 month slow release. How wrong we had it. And ultimately, what I do today is feed soil. And what we've managed to do over the last couple of, nearly 100 years, 10 decades, is we've managed to, to coin a phrase, bugger soil up pretty well. We haven't done a good job. And I don't even turn soil over anymore. I haven't turned soil over in my backyard for probably close on 13 years now. Even spent plants I don't pull out of the ground. I cut them off just below the mulch layer, through the roots, and leave them in the ground.
See, I've heard about this. I think there's a book that I read, maybe you know this, called A Soil Owner's Manual. I think it's by a guy named John Sticker. And it's a very, very short book, like very thin. And he was talking about this. He's a farming, what would you call it? Like a consultant in a sense. And he's all about what you just mentioned there. Like, the roots are so important to the quality of the soil, and the detriment to turning the soil over, and the detriment to putting masses of fertilizer and things like that. And it's a farming book, right? So I haven't been able to really connect it in a specific way to how I would go about my everyday work.
So what gobsmacked me was, and this is what sort of sent me down this rabbit hole. When I left, as I say, as a qualified horticulturalist, I was of the belief that when you plant a plant in the ground, it sits there and it absorbs up through its system the nutrients and minerals that are there. Yeah, is that pretty well what you think?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, we've both got that wrong.
Okay.
Nothing could be further from the truth. Plants can't solubilize minerals. So something else has to make that soluble. So, and that's why soluble fertilizers work, because it makes it available to plants, in an available form.
Yep.
But if you don't fertilize plants and you actually get soil back functioning the way it's meant to, the microbes and the fungi are the ones that solubilize the minerals, and they feed plants through their roots.
Yes.
And they do that in return for the plants feeding the microbes. So to give you an idea, and this is regardless of whether it's ornamental or edible, it's irrelevant. Plants are plants. So through the course of the day, the leaves on every plant are like a solar panel, and they use the sun's rays to use the energy in the CO2 to make simple starch sugars that they use as food, and they make 30% more than they need for themselves. And they exude that out through the roots, the fine root hairs of their what we now call is the rhizosphere, not root system. And they exude that out to feed the microbes. In return for the microbes feeding the plants what they want. And what they do is that they use biochemical signals to attract the right particular mineral they need. So if it's molybdenum, for instance, it might be 300 meters from the plant. So how does it get that? It can't move. So it sends a biochemical signal through these, what they call exudates. They're fine droplets laced with whatever attracts these particular solubilizing microbes. And often it's fungi, because fungi is some of the largest organisms on the planet. Some of them can be 4 or 5 kilometers wide. They're incredible. And of course, they're so microscopic, we don't see them underneath our feet. Okay, so, and to give you an idea of how fine, they're 1/60th the width, not of a root, but a root hair. 1/60th the width of a root hair. Do you see?
Wow.
So it's no wonder we don't see them. So, the 300 meters away, this fungal network solubilizes the molybdenum and ferries it back to the plant in return for the starch sugars that the plant feeds. So when we fertilize plants, we stop the soil functioning, because the plant stops feeding the microbes, because we've taken away the role of the soil. And in doing so, what's happened is that we've killed off much of the microbes in the soil. We've depleted the humus, which is the moisture holding capacity of soil. And in fact, that's that sweet smelling chocolate colored substance that when you screw up in a ball, it holds, nice and firm in your hand. And when you touch it in your open palm, it falls apart again. That's humus. And that's a home for microbes. And that has a huge water holding capacity. And in healthy soil, it's meant to be about 5%. And it's a global phenomenon, not just here in Australia, but we've managed to lose 2/3 of it. We're down to about 1.5% of the humus we should have. And to give you an idea of what that means in relative terms is, if you consider 1 square metre of your garden 200 millimetres deep, or 8 inches in the old scale, if you increase that 1 square metre by 1% more humus, that will hold 17 more litres of water than it could before. And then if you take it up to 2%, that's 34 more litres. And if you get it up to 5%, where it's meant to be, that's 85 litres for every square metre 200 mil deep in your garden that can be held. That's an incredible amount. And if you start to think about, the floods that we've had up in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland, if we were talking about farms being on healthy soil, that wouldn't happen. We wouldn't have those floods. We might have had minor floods, but nothing like we've had, because the humus content in the soil would have been able to absorb not only that amount of water, but it would have fed back the aquifer beneath, and that's what we've done. And because we're turning soil over is a very bad thing to do, because what you do is you actually chop up that whole ecosystem. And this 3-dimensional fungal network called the fungal hyphae network, it stretches and it interconnects with other plants, and they share resources. This is a team effort. That's why monocultures are a very bad thing, because none of that happens, and you put them all into competition for food, water, and light. So the other problem is that when you fertilize particularly edible plants, It's silly to think that we were going to replace 74, natural occurring minerals, trace elements, and nutrients with 3 NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It's just silly. And ultimately, what's happened is that's come back and shot us in the foot a little bit, because since we started really seriously fertilising commercial crops, for supermarkets, and that really happened in the early 70s. In 1965, only 3% of the population had autoimmune disease and dysfunction, things like type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and they're now linking over 80 known diseases to gut microbiome, and a lot of this is diet related. And today, based on what's not in our food any longer, because of the way we've been using chemicals in soil, 47% of us now have autoimmune disease and dysfunction. That's the latest figures I can get in 2022. So it's become more urgent, I think, for me to share and for others to realise that, even though we might be shopping around the outskirts of the supermarket thinking we're buying fresh, healthy produce, often nothing could be further from the truth. It's, number one, not fresh. Number two, it's certainly not healthy because of the way it's been grown for 98% of the time. Even the organic stuff, it takes an eternity to get to your plate. So it loses quite a lot of nutrition over time. To give you an idea, a freshly picked snow pea loses 50% of its nutritional payload within 12 hours of being picked.
12 hours?
12 hours. And corn, this is the clincher, corn loses 40% within 20 minutes.
Within 20 minutes?
Yeah, you nearly need to pick the corn and boil the water at the same time and be, to be guaranteed of getting the 100%.
Don't pick the corn. Don't pick the corn. Plant the corn in the pot you're going to cook it in, and, and then turn it on.
but that's the scenario, And I mean, the other thing, I'm using a gadget called a refractometer. It's like a sawn-off telescope that you can. It's got a prism in the end of. Grape growers use it to work out when they should pick their grapes when they're at their best. So they've got the highest sugar content in them. Yep, and what it does is it measures dissolved nutrient in the plant systems. So to give you an idea, if I put a drop of distilled water on the lens of this thing, it would measure 0 on the scale. And the scale is measured in bricks, B-R-I-X. And it goes up to about 32 bricks, I think it is, from memory. And if I put a little bit of sugar in that water and give it a bit of a mix and then measure it again, it would measure 2 or 3 degrees bricks on the scale. So, and to give you an idea, distilled water freezes at 0 degrees, and 2 degrees bricks would freeze at -2. So I've just built 2% frost tolerance in that plant.
Yes. Yeah.
You with me? So now,
well, let me just explain that for a little bit for people. Basically, the problem with frost is it freezes the actual leaf itself. And so then that becomes hard, especially in a lawn or a plant that something's going to walk on or brush past. You'll snap the leaf because it's frozen solid. So you're getting 2 degrees more flexibility within that sort of. Yeah, exactly. So and then it's interesting because you would find how many other modes of we'll go down this rabbit trail after you finish this point, but the money isn't always in. The money, just like with human health, there's an incentive to pay to buy more drugs or therapeutic treatments or things like that, where there's a profit incentive. Simply saying to somebody, so you mentioned, let's say, diabetes, right? It's like, okay, well, instead of focusing on energy on preventing diabetes, let's just treat it, right? And there's a profit incentive. There's not much profit incentive in saying to people you should stop eating Zinger boxes, even though everybody who listens to this knows I love a good Zinger box, right? Like and I wonder that with the farming as well.
They don't make any money from making you well, mate.
No, they don't. Because here's a pushback I've heard with some of the things. Because like I said, I mean, I've got to send you this book because I think it's right up the alley of what you're talking about here. But some of the pushback that I've heard, which is I think well intentioned, is people will say, look, okay, maybe the food is less nutritious, but we have so many people on Earth, we couldn't feed them all without these mass fertilization programs. And it's sort of like, oh, we'll take the good with the bad. I wonder, is there people out there in Australia who are starting to do, like you talk about, not turning over the soil, not doing the fertilization, and how they getting similar yields? Or, I mean, I guess there's in my head as I'm saying this as well, how much food do we throw out? Do we really need to? I don't know. This is not my world. I'm just curious about it all.
We're still one of the top 10 food wasters in the world. The system that we use is called the just-in-time food system, which means that our supermarket shelves are populated with food just enough, just in time, before it's got maybe 2 or 3 days shelf life left in it, which is unfortunate. And you can't buy a single spring onion for the recipe that you're going to use. You're going to buy a bunch, and if you don't use the others in a few days' time, you're throwing them out. While we're on that subject, that's gold. I mean, that stuff that most of us are sending to landfill is absolute gold. I mean, the more diverse you can make your compost and feed that soil will give you a much bigger nutrient density in the plants you grow. It's just something we need to stop doing. We've got to take a bit of ownership of what we're producing with waste and either put it through a worm farm or have a compost bin or compost heap or whatever we can do to get people to do more of that. Look, and I don't think that everyone, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that everyone should be starting to grow their own food. I mean, that's ridiculous to think that everyone has got the time, the space. But for those that are, raising a young family and so forth, I can assure you, you really should start and question your food a little bit more than perhaps we have in the past. It's getting to the point where the sickness within the community is way up there, and it's all about prevention rather than the throwing drugs at it, because that doesn't solve the issue. The issue still snowballs and gets bigger as the population gets bigger, and it's and it is based basically on what we're eating. It's mostly diet related, and to say nothing of the fact that we've been a bit disconnected from our food is an understatement. We once upon a time used to preserve, and I still do them. You can look behind my side. I mean, the shelves are populated with pickles, and we make our own passata and all that sort of stuff. I mean, I make my own cheese, my own salami, my own sourdough bread. So
you've got 300 spare Roma tomatoes from one plant out the front. You've got to do something with them.
Well, that's it. But that's ultimately the scenario. We no longer eat in season. That's the other problem. We walk into a supermarket and most of us have got no idea, what's in season and what's not. And there's a price to be had for that, because if you're picking stuff that's out of season, then where has it been grown and how has it been grown? If it's been grown in hydroponics, honestly, I mean, that's just the worst food you could probably eat, because it's been disconnected from soil. And the problem with disconnecting things from soil, or a good healthy soil microbiome, is that you're not getting that nutrient density from that food. If it's been chemically fed, you're not getting any of the bacteria that you need to populate your own gut microbiome, which is one of the causes of the sickness in the community, which is a bit of a problem. So
if we go so we're talking about health, I mean, I want to cycle back a little bit to some of the practical stuff about how people can do this themselves, right? But staying on the subject for health, and because you're talking about, for me, I love a good conspiracy theory, right? And I don't like people throwing out the word conspiracy theory as a derogatory term, right?
Yep.
Because what I think it is I love it even when they're stupid conspiracy theories, because they're just fun to talk about. But
I agree.
It's just a fun thought experiment. That's the word I'm looking for. I got a friend who's a flat earther, and we were climbing This is like 5 years ago. I was climbing Mount Kilimanjaro with a flat earther once, and it was a very interesting experience. I'm not a flat earther, right? And anybody who is, no judgment. I've got an opinion, but we can still be friends. And I'm climbing this mountain with this flat earth, and I can see at the top of this mountain the curvature of the earth, right? It's the tallest mountain in the southern hemisphere, right? And Kilimanjaro is a volcano, a former active volcano. So it's not in a mountain range where you can't, like if you climb the Himalayas, not that I have, but if you climb the Himalayas, like you can't really see that far because it's just like, oh, there's another mountain, But this is like, no, it just juts out, and it's like, there it is. And so anyway, it's interesting. You have these conversations and you go back and forth and you talk about this sort of stuff. So there's that side of thing. And I do think there is this profit incentive motive to not make people sick. But I also think, having had a very severe autoimmune disease, that it's just too complicated sometimes to solve. Like I remember going to my doctor. So I've got a disease. Most listeners will know I've got something called ankylosing spondylitis. And I went from running ultra marathons in 2019 to not being able to work in 2020. And it was about 2.5 years. What got me better, believe it or not, was not the $500 injection I took for every 2 weeks or whatever it was. That helped a bit. But it was actually things like I do a lot of stretching. I eat 1 meal a day. That's it. Right. I do ice baths. I do things like that. That made more of a benefit. And now I can go out and work. And I work at my own pace. I do maybe 3 days a week. So I'm somebody who's in that world, who's struggled with that. And it was actually diet stuff that helped me respond better. Right. And I go to the doctor, and the doctor is like, she's busy. There's not enough of them. Right. And I've got a complicated medical issue. And she's just she's got like 15 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever, down for me. And she's 45 minutes behind. If I was her, it doesn't matter how, all the other stuff doesn't matter. She's just got too much on her plate. And so it's so easy to get to this sort of tick and flick. And I wonder if that's the same case with a lot of farmers or people like that, where it's just like, it's just too, like, we know the fertilizer works. Let's just use it. Oh, whatever. And it's just easy. It's just always the way it's always been. And unfortunately, it takes, for me, I did a lot of research on my own. And luckily, I have some family members who are in the medical industry as well, and they helped out, and good friends and stuff. And that's how we came across the solution. But it's really interesting that. So what I'm saying is, I don't mind going down the rabbit hole of going, okay, where's the conspiracy? Is there somebody at the top who's orchestrated this all to become a billionaire? But it's probably a little bit more complicated. There's other things going on. You know what I mean?
Look, I agree. Look, it's a huge industry, the health industry. And if you stop and think about all of the, the supplements and all the things that go along with it, including doctors and hospitals and rehabilitation and you name it, it's a huge, huge money spinner. So I've got no doubt that, I'm not sure about the conspiracy, but, the thing that strikes me is that there's so much more attention and energy being given to the microbiome at the moment. They're now calling it the second brain, and they're starting to investigate. We're more bacteria than we are ourselves. Which is something that a lot of people don't realise, and we're heavily dependent on those bacteria. And when you think about a tablespoon of soil, has more bacteria in it than there are humans ever walked the planet, and each and every one of them have a
Say that again.
One tablespoon of healthy soil has more bacteria in it, more microbes, than there have people ever walked the planet, which is over 10 billion. Jeez. And each and every, some of them are single-celled organisms, but they all have a unique role and function to play, and they are there to make soil function. And some, some only live for minutes, some live for hours, some live for days, and they all have these different functions, and they're intrinsically linked to, and if we get soil wrong, we get everything wrong. Everything you grow in it, everything you consume from it, including, if you fertilize paddocks that you're going to graze cattle over that you're going to consume. You disconnect the cattle from the plants and the soil microbiome. It's all interlinked. It's a knock-on effect. And when you sort of start to drill down a little bit in how this plays out, we're operating off 8% of our DNA. That's mind-blowing to me. 8% of our DNA, that's all we operate off. 92% of it has been called over many years junk DNA, but it's not junk DNA at all. They're starting to work out. It's been switched off. Okay, and it's been switched off because we're not consuming enough of the good bacteria that form the catalyst to switch it on. And that comes from what we're not getting from the food that we eat or we produce. And when you start to understand using chemicals, growing food with that stuff, you disconnect the soil from the plants, and the plants then suffer. And so do we as a result. And it's taken us this amount of time, and particularly over the last probably 5 years, as modern technology is getting a much closer look as technology. Some of the crude technology they looked at once before, they didn't, bacteria and fungi and particularly the soil microbiology was largely ignored. They couldn't duplicate it, they couldn't propagate it, they couldn't sell it. So there was hardly any money ever invested in it. So it was, as I say, largely ignored. But all of a sudden, they've realised they might be very small in number, but they're huge in function, and they have a role to play in our own health, as we're starting to understand. That's why I say that what we all should be starting to focus more in on is how we get nutrient dense food, stuff that when out of the mouths of grandkids, mate. I've got 10 grandkids. My eldest daughter used to ring me and she'd say, "Dad, will you please stop feeding my kids your strawberries?" I'd say, "Why? What's the problem?" She said, "Because they won't eat mine." Well, where do you get yours from? She said, "Well, I get mine from the supermarket." And of course, I taught Michael and Jack how to pick strawberries, and they would eat them while they were picking. I don't pull them. You've got to, take them off properly. And that comes about because I produce organic strawberries. I don't use any chemicals. I'm a beekeeper as well, so I don't use any chemicals on anything in the garden. So it's always been organic, and more so now with what I've discovered in soil microbiology. It's even more concentrated on making great compost. But that taste and flavour, that's the telltale sign. And most of us don't have a benchmark to measure against what is a good strawberry and what is a bad strawberry, because most of us haven't tasted a good organic homegrown strawberry to know the difference. And when they've tasted it, they ain't eating the strawberries from the supermarkets because they taste like crap and there's nothing in them. And it's because when you give plants the ability to grow naturally as they're meant to be, and they're fed all the wonderful things that those microbes deliver, one of those things is flavonoids, flavour, and that's why we've got taste buds. We're able to tell the difference between what is a crap piece of food and a really good piece of food. You know yourself. You pick something that tastes like, you're not going to eat another one.
I do hear it every now and then where people will say things like, "Man, I love podcasts. I hate the ads." Right? Can you give me 5 seconds to try and change your mind on this for a second? The reality is, if you love the podcast, love the ads, listen to the ads and support the ads, whether it's me or anybody else. And the reason is, the reality of this model of business is that the podcast does not survive without the ads. If you love what we're doing at the podcast, here are 2 things you can do to support us. 1, jump on the lawn shed. We talked about them before. You're probably busy mowing a lawn, cutting some hedges, driving, something like that. Jump on the lawn shed, make a trade account, just check out the products that they have. Say you found us through the Australian Lawn and Garden podcast. You don't even have to buy anything right now. When you do need something, jump on there and that will support us. The second thing is our Patreon account. If you're not somebody who wants to buy products or you want to support in an even, a more direct way, jump on Patreon. You can support us through 2 things. 1, very topical. You can buy me a Pepsi Max every month, or you can buy me a Zinger box every month. Full disclaimer, I don't actually spend that money on those specific things is actually more likely to go to things like the costs of actually running the podcast. But it's just a fun, lighthearted way of going about it. So honestly, if you want to have the podcast keep going, there's a huge amount of time that goes into this. If you have learned anything that is worth $5, jump on Patreon, support us to that amount. If we haven't done anything of any value, then don't support us because we don't deserve it. But I hope we have done something. Jump in there, support us, help us to keep going. It's a lot of work, and I'm sure you can understand. Anyways, let's get back into the podcast. Let's get down to the practical side of this, because I was going to say before that I don't have any plants at the moment because I've just moved house. But that's actually not true. I do have strawberries that I still have in a pot that I brought over. They're not ready yet, and they're tiny because I spent no time or attention on them. But my daughter keeps telling me that they're ready, even though they're like completely, the wrong color. Strawberries are ready, Dad. No, they're not, Emmy. They're not even close. You just want to try it. She's 2.5. But so here's one thing that I wanted to touch on, right? So I want to circle back and explain something that we talked about a lot of different things there, but you're talking about when you feed the soil, you break the connection between the plant and the soil. This is something that I did learn through John Sticker, and I hope he's saying his name right. But I'll post a link to the book, and for those, but it's called Soil Owner's Manual. Very short. It's on Audible. You can listen to it about an hour and a half. But he was saying that, like you just mentioned. So this is stuff that, like, I'd heard it a couple of years ago. I'd never really heard about it in the home garden, only in this farming context. So these I'm joining some dots as we're talking, but the plant exudes more basically food for the microorganisms, so that they can convert the nutrients in the soil already, so that the plant can take it up.
Yeah.
And they get this relationship. And what I understand is that when you fertilize, the plant doesn't need that relationship anymore. And so it hurts the microorganisms, which is like a drug addict in the sense that you need more and more and more, because, the soil is being, it's not being supported or helped through the plant like it used to be.
Yeah. So
you make yourself more dependent.
That's in a nutshell sort of correct. Yes. Plants need minerals or nutrients to be made in an available format, and fungi and the microbes, the bacteria, solubilize them and they ferry that back. There's another thing that happens, and to give you an idea, that fungal hyphae network is vitally important. It's one of the reasons why I tell everyone to put their garden fork back in the shed. Leave it near the compost. That needs turning, but nothing else does. If you're going to dig a hole, to put a plant or a tree in, well, okay, you got to dig a hole. But as for turning soil over, forget it.
And what's the specific reason for turning the soil over? Because I know we talked on it very briefly.
No, it's ingrained in us. You go and buy a punnet of cabbage and you come home with a bag of manure and you get on the end of a fork and the manure and you turn the soil over and turn it in and then mound up the rows and then you plant the whole row. I mean, that's how it is,
and that's breaking apart there's like a colonies of microorganisms, right? And just tearing them apart, right?
Correct. You're basically chopping up the fungal hyphae network, which is vitally important. That, and I don't want to get into the specifics of this because we'll be giving someone a science lesson, and they don't want that, I'm sure.
I told you this would be 17 hours.
Some of these fungi drill into the roots of other plants, and they actually extend the capacity of that root system by 10 times. That's how important that fungal network is. So if you come along with your garden fork and you chop between, turn some soil over, you've just chopped up that network, which was feeding your plants. And by the way, the good, the soil has its own microbiome, and the whole point behind a microbiome is to have good bacteria to protect you from the bad bacteria. That's what it's all about. That keeps us healthy. Same in the soil. You've got good bacteria and bad bacteria, good fungi, bad fungi. Around the plant's roots, the rhizosphere, the good bacteria protect the plant from the bad bacteria and so on. Do you see? They did a test over they did an experiment in a fir forest, which is a conifer, in Germany, and it was about a square 3 kilometres or thereabouts. And what they did was they introduced a pest to one of the fir trees, and this tree switches on a unique enzyme in response to this pest, and it's unique to this one tree. And they suspected that the fungal network would alert the other trees to the fact that there's a pest in the forest. So they sat back and they monitored these trees, and within 48 hours, every tree in the forest had the enzyme switched on, yet the pest had not migrated. From that first tree.
Yeah.
Within 48 hours, this fungal network had gone ahead and allowed this to take place. So it was warning. It was in as much saying, "Hey, switch on that enzyme because we've got that pest on tree number 1. We're going to get in trouble if we don't turn these enzymes." And that's basically what took place. So, that's the other thing. I mean, not only is it solubilizing minerals and ferrying them back to the plants, and they need something from the whole periodic table. They don't just need NPK. Like I said, 74 natural occurring minerals, nutrients, and trace elements. They need zinc and molybdenum and gold and silver and you name it, they need it. And they might only need small amounts of it. And they lure by way of exuding those starch sugars that they make through a process called translocation. It happens at about 4:30 in the afternoon when the plant starts to download its sugars for itself, and it uses much of it for its own food. And they do that on a daily basis. Plants need to be fed every day. They make 30% more than they need, and they exude that out called exudates, feeding those microbes. And they're bringing them back. And by the way, there's a bit of a marketplace that goes on in soil. If fungi 1 and fungi 2 have molybdenum, and the fungi 1's molybdenum's better than fungi 2, it gets fed before the number 2 does. So it takes preference off higher quality minerals from one to another. So
what you're saying is plants are capitalists. Is that what you're saying?
Well, not only that, but they're farmers. They're also farmers. They farm microbes.
That's true. There you go.
So what they also do is down toward the very root tip, they internalize microbes, and they actually will clone some of them. And they invest these clone bacteria around the embryo of the seed. And they populate just like we get our own microbiome and DNA from our mothers. So do the seeds. And what they do is they clone some of these bacteria and they invest that around the seed. So when the seed gets dispersed, and to give you an idea, one barley seed has 8 billion bacteria around the outside of it, on the inside of it, around the embryo. It's unbelievable, 8 billion. And if it doesn't have that, then the seed's in trouble. I mean, when a seed gets dispersed from the plant and it lands on soil, how does it know? How does it know whether it's 10 feet deep or a centimetre deep, or whether it's winter, summer, autumn, spring, whether it's wet, cold, dry? Is it in shade, sun? How does it tell? It can't move. It can't think. Can't see. So the bacteria use biochemical signaling, these auto-inducers, and they respond to the seed, and they tell the seed basically where it's at. And to dispel that, what they did was they sterilised the outside of a seed coat, and they got it to germinate, and it grew roots in the air. It didn't know whether it was up or down. So the bacteria is there to tell it where it is. Do you see? So it's vitally important. When you muck around with fertilisers and chemicals around these plants, putting fertilizers anywhere near seeds or seedlings is a very, very bad thing to do, and we don't realize it. And the problem then is that we start to get deficiencies or plants that look a bit sick, and unfortunately plants that are fertilized, the Brix levels plummet, and insects can't consume plants that are above 12 Brix. They're nutrient dense. You'll find that most plants get attacked on older, aging, yellower leaves on plants. Yep. That's because the Brix levels are low. Insects are trash collectors. If you grow trash, they'll come in, and they're there to take out the weak in the gene pool. and they move in on the weak plants, or weak leaves. So it's vitally important that you keep that, so not only taking fertilizers away, and this is the other thing. I mean, I listened to a guy a little while ago, a lady explained this, that, it's a bit like a newborn chick. When we feed plants, we get a handful of fertilizer when we put that beside the seedling or sprinkle it around the seedling. It'd be a bit like a day-old chick putting 12 months worth of food beside it. The chick needs to feed every day, as does the plant. And it'll be able to eat the first day's food, but over time that food is going to degrade and it's going to be of no use to anything or anyone. Same with the fertilizer in the plant. And the plant can only take up about 10 to 40% of the nitrogen that is applied to it. The rest becomes fixed either in soil, in the atmosphere, or runs off the soil into our creeks and rivers. And to be honest, when you understand that 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, why on earth we're applying nitrogen on anything is beyond me. Microbes have been solubilizing and drawing down that nitrogen and making it available to plants through their roots, through this process since time began. This fertilizing scenario has come about from just after the Second World War, where they had a heap of NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, left over from making bombs or ordnance, and very clever scientists have worked out at a set ratio. This became great plant fertilizer. And as they were repopulating the planet, they realised, we need to be able to grow food quickly. And it did exactly what it was designed to do. The problem is, though, that we didn't realise or understand how detrimental that would be to the soil over, the last 10 decades. We're applying 10 times the amount more than we used to, so to get the same sort of results. And a lot of the nutrients that are not used get locked up in soil and become unavailable to plants, and then they putrefy the soil, and it's a bad scenario basically. So we really need to get back to the path of stop feeding plants and feeding soil with good organic matter, making sure always that you've got a cover of mulch. We've got to start and think about how to feed our soil like a forest floor would be fed from above. The leaves and the twigs, that's the organic matter we're going to provide in compost.
Yeah.
Water it in very quickly so that it settles down, and we're attracting in worms and the soil food web to come and do what it does best. It's been doing it since time began, chewing big things up into smaller bits for the whole process to take place and decompose. I've practiced this for the last 2 years now, and it's not about making big heaps of compost. It's about making really good, diverse compost. Anything that's come from the ground can go back in the ground. I even buy bales of pea straw or lucerne, and I just small amounts in layers, basically high and low nitrogen layers, and I just bandicoot what's ready at the bottom, and I put it through a sieve quickly. I'm time poor, so I don't spend a lot of time at it. And I might make a bucket of, about a 14-litre bucket of sifted compost, and I'll broadcast that over the top of the plants and in between the soil, in between the plants, and over the plants, and I'll water that in very quickly, and that'll settle down through the mulch. And then all of a sudden the worms start, and if you build it, they'll come, I assure you. Worms make humus 4 times faster than any other decomposition process we know. Which is that wonderful, water holding capacity stuff we need more of. We need to get it back up to 5%. It's only at 1.5. So, and what they do is as they surface the feed from this organic matter that we're applying, they make wonderful tunnels that provide great water infiltration and aeration to, particularly in anaerobic soils, particularly heavy clay and the like. But they still go through, and they line the inside of these tunnels with specialist microbes that nothing else makes. And they'll bait nematodes on the way back down. And of course, anything that goes through a worm, on the other end of it, it comes out coated in calcium, which is vital for the nutrient uptake of all plants, which is happy days. So, and if you encourage more of that, and by the way, the golden standard for a good population of worms in the garden is 25 per shovelful, which is it's pretty big. I've got to say, I'm not quite there, but I might be halfway there, maybe.
Yeah.
So The other thing that I found is that
you would think that was almost too many. Like if somebody had that in their garden, they'd be like, "Man, what have I done?" You know, like that's such a rare. Like I don't know of anybody who's gotten. Yeah.
well, I
I've
do.
had sections in my lawn that had insane amounts of worms coming up. Didn't bother me, but yeah.
No, but that's good because there's obviously plenty of organic matter. I mean, that comes about, if you catch lawn when you cut it, you take the organic matter away. And if you take the catcher off your lawn and just take a third of it off and leave it to basically naturally make its way down through the thatch in your lawn, that becomes great organic matter, and the worms will come and aerate the soil for you. You don't need to aerate soil. You just got to make sure you feed it and get it back functioning and get the soil food web back into play. And the problem with fertilizers is that it disconnects everything. And in vegetable gardens particularly, most people don't put mulch. They don't put any companion plants. And that's the other thing. We've got a 75% decline in flying insects. Do the splat text next time you go out for a bit of a country drive and see how many insects you hit on the way there. I can cast my mind back, 30, 40 years, and I would maybe have to fill up my water bottle once if I was on a couple of hour drive, because you would use it getting rid of all of the splats on the windscreen. Now I can drive 2 hours and not hit a one. That's a bit of a worry, and it comes about from how we've mismanaged soil and the chemicals we've been using. So it really is. It's becoming more pressing that we understand, that there are much easier, and take the hard work out of it. Who wants to be on the end of a fork turning soil over? Or pulling weeds out, that's a nightmare. Pull weeds out and put a plant in its place and be able to have something to put on your plate, and something that's vibrant and colourful to look at, with companion plants, attracting in a lot of these beneficial insects, things like pollinators and predators that will take out the things that are maybe considered insect pests. It's about trying to build your own ecosystem, for want of a better word. In the four walls of a house, or the fences in a house, like, and I'm only on 500 square metres, I might point out. We're nearly 85% self-sufficient. We produce more than we can use. I feed quite a lot of other people, with what we produce on the property. But I don't. Again, I don't have any insect pest problems, and I often say that a very healthy garden is one that's buzzing. Insects coming and going, doing their thing. That's a great ecosystem. We've even got a little frog bog, small pond out the back with some aquatic plants and so forth that, attract in all sorts of, dragonflies and, all sorts of midge and the like, So it really is important to consider these sorts of things and fill your garden up. And by the way, topsoil, if you look after it, does the hard work of carbon storage. And that's the other thing I have neglected to talk about. The topsoil stores more carbon in it than any other thing on the planet. And provided we leave it put, if we don't turn soil over, it stays put there for stable carbon for 30, 40 years. Whereas the minute you get on the end of a fork, you oxidise that carbon, you put it back up in the atmosphere when you don't want it. And that's the problem. So keeping soil covered, cutting off the plants and leaving the root system in so that adds organic matter. It also leaves the microbes and the root system and the fungal hyphae network in play. It leaves them busy doing what they were going to do anyway. And all you need to do is to dig a small hole beside the old stem of where the root system of that plant is, and put a new plant in there, water it in with a biostimulant, something like a diluted worm juice or go-go juice or Populate. There's plenty of them. Vasili's Eco Butch or Liquid Gold, they're really good. Even sea salt. And that stimulates the microbes, and it tells the microbes, hey, there's a new food source. And of course, the good bacteria help protect that root system from the bad bacteria because it's a food source. It's going to, through photosynthesis, feed the microbes. So it's a very simple thing. We've overcomplicated gardening to no end, and you stand at the end of a hardware store, where there's all the fertilizers and all the soil amendments, and let me tell you, get out of there. You don't need any one of those things. At best, you might need a biostimulant and some mulch, but that's all you need. You don't need any of that stuff. Soil has it there. You just got to get it soil back functioning properly, and it does that through being fed like a forest for organic matter. Save that stuff from going to landfill, turn it into really good, easy stuff that you can apply. It's just it takes no time, and you'll be gobsmacked at how healthy your plants will be. You won't. You'd be mind blown. Seriously, you walk through my backyard. It's not, as I say, it's only a small backyard. To see the health of these plants, and not one of them have had any fertilizer, of any sort. It's remarkable. So
the thing I find interesting, because here's when we talked about back before, we were talking about the worms. Here's what I actually did that because I've been listening to a few different things and trying out and experimenting, like I told you before. And one of the things that I did is I had this section of grass that I'd been looking after and watering, and then I had a section of my house that I completely let go for years. So I would just cut it down, but I wouldn't water it in summer. We're in WA, so it's incredibly sandy soil, very little organic matter, very little clay or anything else. And so we have real problems with hydrophobic soil, all that sort of stuff. So what I did, which is not what your typical landscape would recommend, but as an experiment, I just laid kikuyu on the sand that I already had. And I wanted to see what sort of practices I could do to get the quality there. And that's where the worms ended up going crazy. And so a little bit of pushback with what you were saying is the thing that I did, I heard a guy talk about how with lawns and some annuals like weeds, how you talked about not pulling the weed out, cutting the weed off, letting the dead roots stay in there. We talked about how that is adding carbon to the soil, right? Yeah. And lawns don't keep their roots. Their roots grow and die and grow and die and grow and die.
Correct.
So the best way to add organic matter to a soil that's low in organic matter is just to encourage as much root growth as possible. And the way that I actually did that was through just a lot of aeration. Now I've got an aerator, right? But there's this correlation between how soft the soil is and how the roots grow, like really hard, compact soil. And then, also like you talk about having that mulch layer covering, right? That's essentially sort of what grass sort of is like this. It protects the soil, keeps it moist. So as long as you've got this moist soil, and it was probably a year and a half between that lawn being completely neglected, that soil being completely neglected, and there being patches where it was really high in worms. I just know because like you wake up in the morning, there's always worms castings everywhere. What I'm really interested is, so I've been challenged with this sort of philosophy of like, okay, we don't want to throw chemicals at things just because, right? And there's times where you might have, just no other option because things are just like, you just got to restart, rip everything out, start again. How would you go with? So let's say you've got a citrus tree, right? Because they're very hungry trees, right? And somebody who's looking at growing food, it's very common. Yeah, you're very common to have some sort of discoloration on the leaf or something like that. The standard mode of action would just be to go, just get a fertilizer, chuck it down, right? So what are you doing? You talked about your compost, you talked about that. But do you have to sort of temper your expectations? Is this a long-term plan? Is this a long-term thing to get the result?
There's always a short-term fix for these things. And you've got to weigh up where you want to head. and you're right, citrus inherently are growth feeders, and one of the reasons why you often get and every citrus, be it in a pot or in the ground, they're all very shallow rooters. They're shallow root systems, no taproot, and what ultimately happens is that the heavy metals sink down below where they need them. Right. They can't reach them. So things like zinc and iron and molybdenum and the like settle down within them, and that discoloration shows you a deficiency in the trace elements or trace minerals that's available to them. So I've got one out the back that often I have to sprinkle a little bit of trace elements underneath, or sometimes I'll get some tin paint cans and cut up and chuck underneath and let that rust. And I used to think my old man was a bit bloody crazy. He used to grab handfuls of old bent nails and he'd throw them underneath the lemon tree. And I'm thinking, well, what the hell is he up to? And now I understand. I don't do that because I get grandkids to go running underneath it. But certainly something that's going to rust and allow that iron to get down. I mean, it's a crude way of being able to get there, but so that's ultimately that's the short-term fix, to use some trace minerals, and occasionally, depending upon how bad the deficiency is, will depend on whether I use them or not. Often I don't. I would rather put that compost, and I just beef the compost up a little bit. So
it's a long-term solution. It's a complete sidebar, but you might find this interesting. There's a guy I like watching on YouTube called Smarter Every Day. You might have seen his stuff. Some of his videos go viral, but many years ago, he had a friend who found a magnetic worm. Right?
Magnetic worm.
Magnetic worm, right? And he had to work out what was going on. And what he worked out was, long story short, you can find this video on the internet, is the guy was angle grinding. And he was angle grinding near the soil. And so all these tiny, tiny little like steel shavings, which have iron in them, the worm was eaten through the soil. And I can't remember how he found out that it was magnetic. Like he might have put a magnet down and then came back and the worm is stuck to it or something or whatever it was. But yeah, it literally was these worms were eating the iron shavings. And so when you talked about that, like with your nails, I wonder if you could literally go, I want more iron in my soil. I'm going to like angle grind some steel.
Let me put this to you. I've now got a soil test kit that measures the microbial density in soil. It's very new. They're not available here in Australia. I had to get that in from the United States. It's called a microbiometer. And part of the process is to obviously get a little bit of soil. You dig down about 50 mil or so, or even up to 100 mil, and get a small amount of soil, and you sieve it. And you also use a magnet, and you take out all the magnetic particles out of the soil. So things like iron and zinc and the like, that's anything that's able to be taken out of that soil via the magnet, it will take. And you'll be surprised at how many minerals have got, something that will attract to the magnet. I was a bit shocked. I went, bloody hell, I had no idea. I mean, it makes sense, obviously, but not until you apply something like that. So, and then, of course, you mix it in a solution and you do the test. So it takes about 20 minutes. And I'm chuffed to say that my soil came back very, very well, up in the high 90%, which is kind of good. But, I've been doing a little bit of work with regard to it. So, I mean, to give you an idea, this is how serious I've become. I've got a digital microscope that I actually go and take soil samples.
It's a urine sample, Joe.
Yeah.
Don't get those mixed up.
No.
Give the doctor the soil sample and then start putting your own urine under a microscope.
But you'd be surprised to see the, I'm one of those blokes who's all very well for me to sit in on lectures and do all this sort of research. But remarkably, I like to see some of it for my own good. it's great seeing it on a screen or in a PowerPoint presentation, but I want to see it for myself. And that's kind of been a bit of a journey for me, because I know when I first started out, the soil wasn't where it needed to be, and it now is, but it's taken a little bit of time and effort in understanding how to get it there. And one of the things that I've learned along this journey is to, just like a forest, and diversity is the key to success. I mean, you think about the most diverse place on earth, the Amazon rainforest. There's no pest or disease pressure. The carbon stored in soil, the humus content's 18%, not 5%. Huge rainfall. It's an incredible place. What was I saying? I've lost my train of thought.
You're talking about the Amazon soil.
So looking at the difference that I was making in soil and physically, literally seeing the change being made by what I was doing. Diversity is the key to success. And when you put 4 or more plant family groups together, something magic happens in the soil. I'm not sure why, but all of a sudden the microbial population literally explodes in number. And that's because they think that it's the teamwork. They help share resources. Whereas if you've got only one plant family group, it depletes the microbial population. There's no coordination going on. It starts to step up, but the minute it hits 4, the microbial population explodes. So you can imagine, when I've got beds out there, which are not very big beds, but I've got up to 9 different plant family groups in there. So brassica. Again, I don't want to give people a science lesson, but just think about the different types of plant family groups. You can download a list of them. For instance, Brassicaceae family, brassicas, Brussels sprouts, broccoli,
things like that.
Cabbage, kale, all those. Even nasturtium is a brassica. Bok choy, pak choy, choy sum, they're all brassicas. So some things may not be obvious that they are in the same family, so it's worth getting these lists. Remembering also about the what goes well on the plate together goes well on the ground together. I use that quite a few times throughout my books, and it seems to stick with people, and they remember that, and that's kind of good, because it helps to get them. Basil, tomato, and garlic. There's 3 different plant family groups straight away before you even start. Put a marigold in there. That's in the Asteraceae family. There's 4. Do you see? Put in a lettuce. The lettuce is in the Asteraceae family. But you see where I'm going, and instantly you've got some happy days going on in the soil, and that's what you want. Whack a sunflower in each of the beds where you're going to put it toward the back, up toward the fence. They're fantastic at attracting in a unique fungal network that you want. It's called the mycorrhizal network, and that's what extends the root zone of plants by tenfold. That's important. So it's all these little 1% things that you can do that will stop you having to spend a fortune and give you a headache on what you should be buying in terms of fertilizers and soil amendments. They're mostly all hard work, expensive, and you'll make frustrating mistakes with them, because you'll lower the plant's nutrient density and the pests and the diseases will move in, and then you're back down there buying other things to amend the problem, pesticides, herbicides, and the like, particularly fungicides. You simply just don't want to put those sorts of things near plants. Generally, if you're getting pests and disease, it means that your soil is not functioning correctly. And when you get your soil back to functioning correctly and you're growing nutrient-dense plants, insects won't bother them. That's the key to success. And when you look at the agri-business dollar revenue, $1 trillion, 98% of it is made by the input costs of the people that are supplying the inputs. That's just ridiculous. It's not our farmers that are making the money out of that. That's just disgraceful. So when you stand at the end of one of those hardware chain aisles and you start scratching your head, please remember this: get the hell out of there. You don't need them. That's going to get you into trouble. Go home and empty out your compost and start and make that gold that is very, very simple to make, and it's good for all of us, good for the planet, good for us, and good for the plants. I mean, that's the reality of it. And it's, as I say, it's not about making big heaps of it. It's just about making small amounts and using it often. A worm farm is a fantastic opportunity. If people can't compost, then get a worm farm. Put that near your back door, near the kitchen. That way, on the cold, wet days.
What do you feel with commercially available compost? So if you go down to local soil supply, they've got some like mushroom compost or something like that.
No, mushroom compost is that gets sterilised before they impregnate or inoculate the compost with the particular mushroom they want to try. So, and by the time the mushrooms are finished with it, there's not much goodness left in that compost. So it's okay, organic matter, but I wouldn't be hanging my hat on mushroom compost. It's really just a medium that you can maybe add to the compost. That's what I would do. I don't put anything on my garden that hasn't gone through the compost first, and that includes some of the organic fertilizers, pelletized manures, for instance, like Dynamic Lifter,
right?
Or Gigantic. Yep. I put them through. I was going to ask about that. Sprinkle every so often. I'll put a sprinkle. I've got my own chickens, so I get chicken manure. But even the chicken manure, I stick that in a bag, one of the feed bags, for about 30 days, so that it sort of off gases the white parts of their droppings. That's the ammonia. They don't urinate. That's the urine side of their dropping, and that's high in ammonia. So you don't want to use that too fresh. Not only can it burn the microbes off, but it's not good for plants either. So I off gas that for about 30 days, and then I throw it on. Same with if you're out buying things like horse manure, you want to set that back for a good 30 or 40 days at least, because they use intestinal worming solutions on horses and sometimes some other livestock. And if that's the case, then you need to make sure, because it's non-discriminate. Even though they're earthworms, they'll still succumb to the worming solution. So it's good fishing to sort of keep it aside. But it's a case of building that diversity in your compost. The more diverse you can get that compost to be, the better off your plants and your garden will be. And if you start feeding soil and not plants, they will be so much better off, because the microbes will come alive, and they'll start and produce and do what the soil's meant to do. It's meant to function this way, attracting more of the insects, the soil food web, and of course getting those worms to get back to business. You don't need to. Please don't go down the local hardware store or the nursery and go buy 1,000 compost worms and tip them in your garden. That's not what they need. The worms in your garden are very different than the composting worms. The worms in your garden are the deep digging worms. They're the ones that we want the aeration from. The composting worms are the ones that chew through the leaf litter, and they break down they're voracious feeders, and they're not from here. They're tigers, red wrigglers, night crawlers, and blues, I think, are the four that they use primarily. And even though when you're using the worm castings in your composting strewn, and they're as good as any compost you're going to get, I can tell you, even better, because they're laced with all that calcium and the minerals that they the specialist microbes that they produce. That's fantastic stuff. But you'll throw out worm eggs, and you'll get composting worms delivered into your mulch layer, which you need. I mean, that's the other beauty of a good mulch layer, is that it becomes organic matter itself, and it starts to slowly but surely break down. One of the favourite mulches that I use at the moment, and it's probably more expensive than others, is Who Flung Dung. It's a Nutrog product, South Australian product, fantastic stuff. It's inoculated, it's biologically active, which is a godsend, really. Stinks a little bit for the first day or two, but it's a good stink. A chicken manure stink.
If you're hoping to have a garden without a stink, then you got a challenge.
Give it up. Forget it. Yeah, that's it. So there you go.
Well, we've got a lot going on. I'm going to say we're at roughly an hour and 25. And like I said, this could be a 17-hour podcast. But how about we finish off with? So we've talked about so many things, but what we haven't talked about, and I think this is a great finish, is what are some great plants that people can start with right now? We're in September. People are going to be motivated listening to this, and they're going to go, cool, okay. We talked very briefly, maybe we can grow a tomato on a tree that we have some space for. You talked about, okay, what goes good on the plate goes good in the garden. There's all these juices, these creative juices going on in people's heads. What can they do? What right now, if you're looking across the country now, you're based in Victoria, is that right?
Yep.
So, but there's different climates and stuff, but keeping that in mind, are there 3, 4, 5 different plants that you think people
absolutely
go out and get this? What's coming to mind?
So we're headed into the salad season. So if I were you, I'd be hunting down some mixed lettuce, and that's kind of good because no doubt in the West, just like me here in the East, we grow thistles and we grow them well.
Yeah.
And if you pull out a thistle and throw in a lettuce, guess what? They're in the same family. So if you can grow thistles, you can grow lettuce standing on your ear. Now, my recommendation would be to get down to your local nursery, and generally what's in the season will be on their shelf now. But certainly mixed lettuce, maybe some beetroot, good colourful plants. There's always room for a beetroot. Wherever there's a hole between your shrubs, trees, front yard, backyard, makes no difference where, whack one in. Leaves you can eat as well as the bulbs, obviously. I would certainly be looking for a tomato or two, or a punnet. So be it. Get a punnet.
The problem with the punnet is I've done this before. I've gotten a whole punnet, and I didn't need a whole punnet. And then, like you say, one bush can produce so much fruit.
Yeah, you're right.
Unless you have a voracious kelpie to eat half of them, then you're still stuck with all these tomatoes you can't use.
Yeah. So, look, when you're selecting these punnets, make sure that they're well spaced. Don't get one that's got 400 seedlings in there because they're going to be useless to you. When you try and pull them apart, you're going to do untold damage. Make sure, when you get a punnet of seedlings, if it's beetroot, maybe 8 maximum. Same with lettuce. You don't want any more than that. And what I do is I use a knife. I've always got one in my pocket, and I cut it open. I slice through the soil.
Plastic?
No. I slice through the soil between the plants, through the roots, and I individualize the seedlings, right? And I just simply lift one seedling out at a time of planting. So what do we got? Mixed lettuce, beetroot, punnet of tomatoes, certainly some basil. Basil and tomatoes go really well on the plate. If you haven't got garlic in there already, then get a punnet of spring onions. That's 5. And then whatever else, maybe some cucumber, because that would round up a good group of plants. Don't forget that you probably want some marigolds, because they're also very, very good with that tomato group and to attract in, or deter.
And they're pretty.
Pests. So, they are indeed. And what I would do is I would put them near your back tap so that you remember to water them each day. And each day when you get home from work, go and get your knife, cut one seedling out, start with lettuce, find a thistle, pull the thistle out, dig a small hole. You don't need to get any extra soil, just use the soil you've got. Plant the lettuce, put a little bit of mulch around it, water it, and go inside. Takes 5 minutes. Tomorrow night when you get home the night after you get home from work, go and find another weed. Front yard, backyard, remember you don't need a vegetable patch to do this. Your soil's fine. Pull out another weed, might be a beetroot. Put the beetroot in its place. Do you hear where I'm going with this? If you had planted in 6 weeks, if you had planted that first punnet of lettuce all at once on the first day in 6 weeks, you've got too much lettuce and nothing coming on. This teaches you to plant staggered and continually successively plant throughout and if you do this for 6 weeks, you'll be gobsmacked at how much less weeds you've got and how much more food you've got. Remembering wide leaf plants, shade tolerant, think about I'm guessing the east side of your plants, so that, you're getting morning sun and shade in the afternoon from the hot sun if they're wide leaf plants, between trees, under trees, between shrubs. You'll be gobsmacked at where you'll find spots. If you can see any soil or mulch, you've got room to be growing something. So that's as simple as it is, folks. It really is. I can't encourage you more to just make the start, and just remember, water them each day. And it's nothing to stop you from planting 2 or 3 if you've got a bit more time than that, but don't go planting a punt at a time of the same thing, because you'll ruin the day. So,
well, you've got a website, right, Craig, and you've got 5 books. What's your website called?
It's Craig Castree, castree.com.au. I do daily blog posts that are free. I've got an online shop there. You can see all my books and all the contents that are in them. Sign up for the daily posts. They're always seasonal. I'll try and help keep you ahead of the seasons. I also post on Instagram on a daily basis as well. And on Facebook. So, yeah.
And your Instagram is a lot of different. You're making your own sourdough. It's a bunch of different things. You've got YouTube as well.
Yeah. It's all on my website.
So lots of stuff there. Go check out the books. Thanks for coming on. I think that hopefully we got some, people, if you get motivated by this, send a photo of your little garden to either Craig or myself. And I reckon if you send it to me, I might have a little goodie for you. All right. If you've made it to the end of the podcast, you get motivated enough to start maybe growing a tomato up a tree you've got or something like that. Got some spare space. Send us a little photo. I've got a little goodie for you.
I'll tell you what. I'll go one further. If they you pick the best one of the lot, and I'll send them out a book of one of. I'll send them out Edible Gardens, a practical guide. That'll give them. That'll give them a very, very helpful guide of being able to turn their existing garden into a completely edible oasis. So.
I tell you what, there's going to be a bunch of people who've made it to the end of this, and surely, if you've made it this far, people, go take some action. Go have some fun. I've in my head what I'm going to do, Craig. I've got a spot. I think I can get some lettuce in there.
That's the shot.
Very easily. I know exactly what that's the spot for. My kids, my daughter is of the age. My son's almost 1, so he's not quite old enough to recognize these things. But she would love it. She would love. Let's be honest. She's a toddler. She'll love planting it and picking it, and then you put it on the plate, and she's not going to. It's just lettuce. I don't touch these things.
Yeah. If you lead, they follow, and that's the thing. It's remarkable. That's why the Stephanie Alexander Kitchen Garden Program works very, very well. That's been a remarkable success here in Victoria. I'm not sure whether you guys know about it, but it's a kitchen garden at schools run by coordinators, and the day that they run kitchen garden, there's no truancy. Everyone turns up. There's no bullying. All the kids eat. Right. They see their peers eating stuff that they normally wouldn't try, and kids will generally grow what they will eat what they grow. So if you can get kids involved in this and start and tell a stories sell. I can assure you, and tell them about the companion plants and how that they'll attract in the beneficial insects and butterflies and what they do. You'd be surprised at just how engaged the kids will be. And give it a go. Yeah. What have you got to lose?
Well, mate, thank you so much for coming on. And people get involved. And someone's going to get a free book. So I reckon we'll give it, because people are busy. I'll give it 3 weeks after the release. You got 3 weeks after the release of this podcast to send us a photo, either to, send them to both Craig and I individually, so that I don't miss any, and I'll pick a winner, and we'll send you something. And if you send me a picture, I'll send you a little goodie as well. Thanks for listening, guys. I'll see you on the next podcast. Thanks, Craig.
Thanks very much.
See you next time.